Welcome to the Smart Money, Dumb Money Show, and I am your host, as usual, Keith Richards. I am President and Chief Portfolio Manager at Value Trend Wealth Management. And today, we are doing one of our special guest interviews. As you guys know, we get away from the charts once in a while, and I like to bring in interesting guests, and today's is absolutely no exception to that. In fact, I've been chasing Franco Terrazanno for several months to get him to come on the show, just because I have watched a number of his videos and I just think this man has something to say. I'm going to give you a brief introduction to his background, and then we're going to get right into it because Franco has a lot of really interesting things to talk about today. So Franco has a background in economic policy. He was with the Calgary Chamber of Commerce, and he's a fellow with the Canadian Constitutional Federation, and that's really interesting. Constitutional rights these days in Canada. He's a Master of Public Policy and a Bachelor of Arts, BA, in business from the University of Calgary. And as I said, he's federal director with Canadian Taxpayers Federation. So interesting background. Franco, so welcome to the show. Really pleased to have you on. Let's talk taxes.
Hey, it's my pleasure. And, I love the name of your show, Smart Money, Dumb Money. Well, the dumb money is certainly present nowadays here in Ottawa because of this federal government. And, we were kind of talking offline about how you really like to tailor your material for the investment community. So I was thinking there's two things that I think your audience should know about when it comes to the federal government and the economy as a whole. And those two things are, number one, where Canada stacks up on tax competitiveness with other industrialized countries. And the other is our growing deficits here in Ottawa, which of course signal higher taxes down the road. So let's start off with tax competitiveness. There is an international think tank known as the Tax Foundation. Every year they put out their International Tax Competitiveness Index. And this year it's bad news for Canadian taxpayers. We have fallen 2 spots behind last year's ranking. So now we are ranked 17th out of 38 OECD countries. So 16 other countries have more competitive tax systems among the OECD than Canada. And a couple spots I want to highlight. So number one, we were ranked 31st on individual tax competitiveness out of 38. So there's 30 other industrialized countries with more individual competitively taxed systems than in Canada, and we were ranked 26th on business tax competitiveness. So it's brutal. And one of the reasons is because the federal government keeps hiking taxes. Speaking of which, the report specifically notes that Canada's taxes capital gains, quote, well above the OECD average.
It's unbelievable. Yeah, and I often talk about this on my blog, which a lot of the viewers today are familiar with. What I've talked about, and I'd like you to confirm this because you're the expert in this area, but I've often mentioned that the problem with the government taxing higher, people say, well, it's good. Don't you want your roads built, and don't you want your, police or whatever? And of course we want all these things, but the problem is that's not what the government spends a lot of that money on. And in fact, it becomes less GDP focused. In other words, that you go out and you invest in something that actually makes money, like a consumer might by spending, or a corporation might by investing in the company. GDP can grow, but when you're sending it to your favorite country, or you're blowing it on, the green slush fund or whatever, giving your money to your friends, it isn't as GDP focused, and therefore it ultimately hurts investors because those corporations that could have used the money can expand on that. Am I leading down the wrong road when I say that, Franco?
Well, there's 2 ways essentially that a government can help grow the economy. It really just comes down to that. There's essentially 2 ways, right? You can have the bottom-up approach, which, acknowledges that people with their own money, with their own skin in the game, are best suited to create jobs, right? So lower taxes and allow entrepreneurs to win or lose in the market. The other way is corporate welfare. a top-down approach where government chooses winners and losers in the marketplace. And what the federal government has done under Trudeau is the latter, the corporate welfare approach, right? So this ties in distinctively with the capital gains tax hike, because on the one hand, you have the federal government going after doctors, small businesses, other entrepreneurs. The tech industry has spoken out against this, taking more money from Canadian entrepreneurs, Canadians who are saving for their retirement, who don't rely on a cushy taxpayer-funded pension. And then on the other hand, the government is giving buckets of cash to a select few multinational corporations to build battery factories. Now, what's the difference? Well, on the one hand, when you're using your own money as an entrepreneur, you are taking your own risks, right? You're also more intelligent about the specific sector that you're in. If you succeed, you are rewarded. And if you don't succeed, you are punished. Over time, the market rewards more successful entrepreneurs. So there is a built-in market mechanism that allows more successful entrepreneurs to stay in the market for longer, right? It's like a positive feedback loop in the market. But with government, think about it. Remember, this isn't like some high-level technocrats planning the market, pulling levers. That's not what happens when you talk about government. What happens when you talk about government are the political incentives, right? How do we win the next election? Is it any surprise that the vast majority of funding for the battery plants paid for by taxpayers are either in southwestern Ontario or in Quebec? Is there any surprise? Because they are playing the political calculation, not the market calculation that is done by entrepreneurs, right? So let's not forget that on the one hand, you have the government taking more money from Canadians through its capital gains tax hike. And then on the other hand, you have these politicians and bureaucrats blowing tens of billions of dollars in corporate welfare to multinational corporations. And hey, let me just add this one point. There's a reason that politicians are politicians and government bureaucrats are government bureaucrats. If they really knew how to succeed in the market, they would be becoming millionaires investing their own money, but they're not. So they're taking money from other people and trying to pretend like they're investment bankers.
Yeah. Oh my God, there's so many places I could go to from here, Franco, but I'll focus a little bit. First of all, in summary, free market, good, captured market, bad. I want to actually I just branch off a little bit. I portfolio manager, and I have the opportunity on occasion to meet with groups of other portfolio managers. And I was very lucky to attend a conference a month or so ago where some of the top hedge fund managers and portfolio managers, mostly from Canada, but several from the United States, were all together in a big room. And it was interesting because the talk right now, when it comes to battery plants, is that lithium's already on its way out, and Canada Ontario just invested in lithium. It's going towards solar state, so it's a solid state, I should say. It's kind of like investing in whatever worked yesterday, and that's certainly not how you make money in the market. But they're not in the market, as you say, to make money. I do want to talk a little bit about a related subject, which is the impact of carbon taxes. So
yes.
Can you address that a little bit?
Yeah, okay, so we can spend a lot of time on this, and you know I like to rant and rave, so you rein me in if I'm going a little bit too long. But like, let me just start with the basics, okay? So number one, the carbon tax is so damaging, as you know, because it impacts almost every single aspect of life throughout the entire supply chain. So there's the most obvious points, right? Where the carbon tax makes it more expensive for people to fuel up their car to drive to work. The carbon tax makes it more expensive for people to turn on the natural gas to heat their home during the winter. But when I talk about the carbon tax having such a detrimental effect on the economy, let's just take the most basic example, buying food, right? So the carbon tax hits farmers, Canadian farmers, when they use natural gas or propane to heat their barns and dry their grain. Then the carbon tax hits the trucker, who needs diesel to fill up their big rigs to bring the food from point A to point B. Then you also have the carbon tax hitting the grocer, right? Whether to use the natural gas to keep the store warm or to even have like cooler sections within the store, right? So all throughout the supply chain, and I've skipped many different elements of it, you see how the carbon tax makes it more expensive for the farmer, makes it more expensive for the trucker, makes it more expensive for the grocer, and then makes it more expensive for the consumer,
So
right?
would you say, if you don't mind if I interrupt here, I mean, it's funny because my assistant, Cindy, many people watching this will know Cindy. She came up to me the other day and goes, how come the Bank of Canada keeps saying inflation's going down, and yet when I go to the grocery store and
Yes.
I have to, buy a new pair of shoes or whatever it is, the day-to-day stuff, the core stuff, you might say, she goes, I don't see any drop in these prices, and yet they say that inflation's dropped from 4 to 2 or whatever it's been. So let's talk about that a little bit.
Yeah. So when you hear that, although they're being technically true, if I can say, it's misleading. It's completely misleading because all the official inflation rate means is that prices are going up. They're just not going up as fast as they were the year before. So prices are still going up, right? But in 2022, the inflation rate was a 40-year high. And remember, the way inflation is calculated is just a percentage change year over year. So we had a 40-year high inflation, or prices went up by 40-year high in 2022. Then prices went up again in 2023, just not as fast as they did in 2022. And then prices are still going up in 2024, just not as quickly as they were versus 2023 on top of 2022. So what you're hearing is essentially misleading. Prices are still rising. They're just not rising as fast as they were when it was a 40-year high.
Yeah, and actually, in my way of addressing the issue, when Cindy and I were talking, I said, if they take into account things like houses and automobiles, which might have fallen, let's pretend, I don't know what the actual numbers are, but 5 to 10% in the past year or so. Housing definitely has fallen in the past year or so. But if your bag of potatoes is the same price, so you don't really have, and that's what she was noticing, is that the bag of potatoes may not have fallen, but it's about the same price. And so she's going, how are they saying inflation is falling? It's not affecting my potatoes, but it's still affecting maybe some bigger tick items like they were way overpriced, like housing, and then they take credit for that. But it doesn't help the average person. So,
No, I mean the average person's getting kicked in the teeth right now, right? Like
yeah.
let's not make no bones about it. I mean, I would hope that much of your audience are doing well, or at least not at the point where they're just worried about getting paycheck to paycheck. But the inflation tax, and I say it's a tax because it's largely occurring because during the pandemic, what you had was almost a different way of financing government spending, right? We all know about taxation, where the government brings in a certain amount of taxes. We all know about borrowing, where the government borrows from the market and then you have to pay it back with interest. But, a common misunderstanding is that what happened during the pandemic, which is different than those two means of raising revenue, let's say, is that a lot of Ottawa's deficits were financed by the printing press, right? So during the heart of the pandemic, you essentially had the Bank of Canada buy up government assets to the tune of $300 billion, right? A lot of people like to call it quantitative easing. At the end of the day, it is the Bank of Canada printing money, right? How does the Bank of Canada get the means to purchase up hundreds of billions of dollars in government bonds? Did the Bank of Canada have a bake sale? No. All of those new dollars are essentially printed out of thin air. Okay, so that is a huge difference between what is normal government business as to what happened during the height of the pandemic. And that explains in large part why you see these inflation going through the roof. Now, you might say, okay, Franco, but there's inflation in many other countries. Yeah, because many other countries also had their printing press running on overdrive, right? The supply chain shock also doesn't account for general price inflation, right? And let me explain why. Because when you have supply chain shocks, and there are always supply chain shocks, as you and your audience will know, like there has been supply chain shocks essentially since the beginning of human commerce, right? But the difference is when there are supply chain shocks, you see movements in relative prices, right? If you keep the monetary base simple, an increase in one price, you'll see decreases in other prices. The only way that you get general price inflation sustained over a long period of time is when you increase the money supply. And that is what happened in Canada, and that is what happened in many different places around the world. And the reason I bring the inflation tax up is because, to circle back to my earlier point, it's this type of tax that does a couple things. One, it distorts market prices, right? You see a distortion of the market because it all depends on who gets the new money first. It's the Cantillon effect, where there's a redistribution of income, essentially. But number two, it's the people who are doing the hardest, who are already struggling to get by, that are most affected by inflation. And the third thing is that the inflation tax is fundamentally an undemocratic form of taxation, right? If the government wants to raise income taxes, if the government wants to raise sales taxes, well, there are presumably votes in the House of Commons, but there are no votes in Parliament when the central bank prints up new dollars out of thin air.
Yeah, and actually, I want to cover another subject in a second here, but just to finish that thought up, our government has used the excuse, at least I've heard this excuse bantered in Parliament, that, well, everybody had to spend money during COVID, and therefore we have this, printing press that went off. And it's true, everybody did. But for some reason, we ended up, and this, at least statistics that I've read, coming from reputable sources like Rosenberg and whatnot, show us at the very, very, very bottom of GDP to per capita in the developed nations. So for some reason, whatever we did or our government didn't work as well as, say, the United States, that actually had, GDP growth during the same period that we were declining. So
can I add just a couple thoughts on that? So
yeah.
So number one, okay, let's just say the government had to spend money. Right? Let's just take that argument as given. I'll poke a hole in it in a second, but let's just take it as given. So the government announced what, like $500 billion of new spending, the federal government, during the COVID-19 pandemic. Well, about $200 billion of the new spending had nothing to do with COVID-19. So what did the government do? The government used the cloud of a pandemic to go on a debt-fueled spending spree, right? Let's say you're a home. Okay. And let's say you have a leaky roof. What do? Okay. You spend some money to fix the leaky roof. What you don't do is borrow money to fix a leaky roof and then borrow more money to buy a brand new BMW, right? You focus on the problem. So that's number one. But as you see, about $200 billion of the new spending had nothing to do with COVID-19. Number two, let's not let the government off the hook, because okay, you spend money on a pandemic, but why couldn't you redistribute funding from other areas of the budget, right? Take money away from other areas of the budget to focus on the pandemic. We saw none of that. What we saw is a government that wants to spend more money on everything forever.
Yeah, in fact, a couple of the politicians out there that are attempting to find a seat in the next election, both the Conservatives and, funny enough, they don't have much of a chance of getting elected, but the PPC, they're both saying the same thing. If you're going to spend, you gotta cut it somewhere else. And I forget what they call that policy, but I think it makes sense, particularly at this point. I want to get back to focus on how this is going to affect us as investors. And I know you're not an investment advisor. That's fine, but what with the amount of taxation, I have seen, by the way, BNN has reported recently that venture capital in Canada, like the people that will invest in new technologies and whatnot, have literally vacated the country because they're mobile. And when they see these capital gains taxes, literally around the time of that announcement, we saw a lot of venture capitalists literally pack up and leave. And that's a real discouragement that hurts us. So as investors, that hurts us as an economy. So what other sectors do you think might might be impacted, or what are areas of the economy, let's say?
Well, I think natural resources is obviously a big issue, right? You know, we've talked about carbon taxes. Most attention gets put on the consumer carbon tax, right? The one that you directly pay at the pumps or the one that you pay on your natural gas bill, for example. There's also an industrial carbon tax in Canada. I'm not sure if you were aware of that, but when the federal government instituted its consumer carbon tax, what it really did was put in a mandatory minimum carbon tax, right? You either pay the federal government's mandatory minimum or you have a provincial one that meets that same mandatory minimum. And if you don't, the federal government will step in and shove its carbon tax down your throat, right? So that's essentially what happened with the consumer carbon tax. The same thing applies to the industrial sector, right? So let's say you have a huge fertilizer plant. And like, as you'll know, that maybe most people, at least in Ottawa, wouldn't ever understand, like for you to have this huge plant that literally that we rely on to sustain our human population, like that takes a lot of capital. You know, like that takes real capital, real planning. And it is those big industrial plants that are also affected by the industrial carbon tax, right? And so we know that there's an election that could happen any day between now and October 2025. Well, I think the question that your investors will have to look at, or your community, the business community at large, is what happens to the industrial carbon tax, right? Because you've heard Mr. Poilievre rightly say he'll axe the tax. Now we know he'll get rid of the consumer carbon tax, but will he also get rid of the industrial carbon tax? So that, I think, is something to keep an eye on, right? Because if Canada keeps going forward with higher and higher industrial carbon taxes, well, that will chase away the big time capital investment that is needed to sustain these types of plants. And one of the reasons I say chase away is because a not well-known fact is that Canada is an outlier when it comes to carbon taxes. 70% of countries do not have a national carbon tax. The US, no national carbon tax. Brazil, no national carbon tax. India, no national carbon tax. Russia, no national carbon tax, right? So I just listed off 4 of the 5 largest emitters in the world, and none of them have these national carbon taxes. So remember, folks, the vast majority of countries don't have a national carbon tax. Canada has a consumer carbon tax, an industrial carbon tax, and also these fuel regulations carbon taxes, which are a whole separate matter. So I think the thing to keep an eye on is what happens with the consumer carbon tax. And if Trudeau is defeated, will Poilievre also scrap the industrial carbon tax?
Yeah, that'll be interesting to see. And by the way, to add to that point of the carbon taxes, you're probably aware, I'm sure you are, the percentage of carbon that Canada emits compared to some of these other countries that don't have the taxes. Like,
yeah,
just to put it, we're the bantamweight in the corner. That is
1.4%. We represent 1.4% of global
yeah,
emissions.
compared to, say, US or China, which is also not doing carbon tax, you know. So anyways, it's kind of like you said, it's all political, right? It's about getting votes. It's about looking a certain way, not necessarily dealing with reality. And I felt that way about the whole EV thing, because you know, from everything I've seen through my interview with Lauren Gunter a few months ago, viewers can go back and look at that, to conversations that, like I mentioned, portfolio manager meetings. The current lithium thing is just, it's like horse and buggy. But anyways, I think I guess I'll wrap up. And I know you can't really comment on this, but we talked about this, and we won't go into this in depth. But you know, there is a potential for the U.S., which is made off okay so far on a lot of these tax issues. Is that, you know, Harris is harping about bringing in a larger corporate tax. That's one of her big things. As well as high income taxes on capital gains, a lot of the stuff that's happening in Canada already. And you know, we can't make comments on whether that'll affect things, but based on what we've seen here in Canada and how it's affected our economy and our competitiveness versus, say, 9 years ago, I think it's fairly clear. And a lot of I guess I don't need you to speak to this, but there's been some pretty heavyweight portfolio managers, like multi-billion-dollar portfolio managers, have come right out, and a lot of these guys stay silent on their politics a lot, but have come right out. I've named names on my blog if people want to look it up, where they've come out and said a Harris majority would actually probably cause, a fairly strong negative impact on the U.S. economy and subsequently the markets. So, I said what I need to say on that, but it kind of ties into everything we're talking about here on Canada's situation. So, in other words, summary is taxes. What are they good for?
Well, hey, let me just if you don't have to cut me off, let me just say one more thing, because there's one more thing I think your people will appreciate, because I mentioned the deficit. So this year, the government in its 2024 budget said it would run a $40 billion deficit. Like, that's insane. Like, there is no pandemic. It's 2024. A $40 billion deficit is insane. And I mean, it means a couple things, right? Like, we all know that it means more debt that you're leaving to your kids and grandkids. Nobody wants that. I think we can agree that is fundamentally unfair. Nobody wants that. Maybe other than these big spending politicians. Another thing it means is, well, perhaps future tax hikes down the road, right? And look, especially with a minority parliament where you have the federal liberals who need to find at least one other dance partner to keep their government afloat. And we all know that the Bloc is pushing for big spending, right? The NDP is pushing for big spending, even further tax hikes. So that's something to keep an eye on. But also, like, let's not forget that the budget problem, unless the government actually rolls up its sleeves and cuts spending, the budget problem is getting worse. And that one of the reasons is because interest charges are getting higher and higher, right? The money that the government just pays servicing the debt. Interest charges on the federal debt are blowing a $1 billion hole in the budget every single week. Astonishing. In fact, every penny that you pay through the federal sales tax is now going to pay interest on the debt. Okay, let me give another little anecdote here. So it took almost 24 prime ministers and about 100 plus years to rack up $600 billion in debt. In less than 10 years, Trudeau has added another $600 billion to the debt. He's doubled the debt. And where I'm going with this is that, as bad as it is, the parliamentary budget officer is forecasting that under the status quo, the government of Canada won't balance the budget until 2040. So I just thought it might be relevant to you and your audience, because we all know what deficits signal. We haven't seen 1 ounce of fiscal responsibility out of this government. And unless things change, there's going to be deficits and deficits and deficits for years to come.
Yeah, and actually that leads into just one final thought. Well, I have many final thoughts based on some of the stuff you just said, but one final thought is, we all pay attention to the currencies. And so technically, the loonie, Canadian dollar, has been bouncing off of a specific support level. Us technical analysts, we look at support levels. And that's around 72-ish cents, 70 to 72 cents. If this level is not held, then we're probably looking at, believe it or not, a 60 odds, like low 60s as far as the loonie versus the US dollar. So this is really important because, of course, that only adds to inflation because our dollar buys less from other countries. So this kind of stuff is, as investors, okay, we go out and we buy other currencies, we buy US dollars, but that's not really going to help us a lot with our grocery bill on a daily basis. We're not going to grow grapefruits in Alberta. So if we're importing them, they're going to cost more if they come from California or something. So these are the kind of things that we need to think about, because the loonie will affect every industry or most industries across the nation in so many ways. So anyways, Franco, if there's anything else you wanna leave us with, or
no, hey, just want to say really, thank you for your time. I really appreciate getting to speak to you and your audience. If you want to learn more about the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, a couple ways you can do that. Number 1, go to our website, taxpayer.com. Number 2, follow us on social media. We're pretty much on all social media channels. Just type in Canadian Taxpayers Federation. If you like Twitter or Instagram, you can follow me at Franco_nomics. But again, best way to follow us is just taxpayer.com.
Well, that's awesome. And actually, thank you for bringing that up, because I did want to encourage readers I actually follow you on YouTube. And I think the material you bring out is important. It's this is material that I always say whenever I hear you or read something in an article that you've written. I always say, oh my gosh, if more people knew this, it would
Yeah.
really, I mean, it would just shock them, but it would also really wake them up to reality right now. Because a lot of people just kind of walk around with a bag over their head. So it's really good that we had a chance to talk today, Franco. I really appreciate you coming on. It was hard to pin you down, and you finally came on the show. So I really appreciate that. And I wish you nothing but success in the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. Just continue the great work, and everybody follow Franco. He puts out amazing work. Thank you again.
Hey, thank you. Really appreciate the kind words.